Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Cristina Setiar. I am an event manager for EIASM, and welcome to the second season of the EIASM webinar series. What is EIASM? EIASM is the European Institute for Advanced Studies in Management. For those of you who don't know the Institute yet, I would like to say a few words about it. The Institute was founded in 1971 and it is based in Brussels. So we celebrate this year our 50th anniversary and we are looking forward to the next 50. We are an international not-for-profit organization, totally independent and neutral. EIASM can be best described as the node of a set of networks bringing together management scholars from all over Europe, as well as from other parts of the world. The EIASM network comprises over 70,000 academics involved in management research and teaching. A few words about the program of this webinar season. We are delighted that during the second season, 2 of our board members, 2 EIASM Interdisciplinary Leader Award recipients, and event chairpersons have accepted to deliver interesting speeches. So check also the other webinar dates on our calendar and feel free to register online. Please check our website, calendar of activities, our social media platforms for more details and news from the Institute. So today, I am very happy to present to you Professor Eero Vaara, who is going to speak about what we can learn from studying unusual organization. Eero Vaara is professor in organizations and impact at Saïd Business School, University of Oxford, and visiting distinguished professor of organization and management at Aalto University School of Business. His research focuses on organizational and strategic change. He is a world-leading expert in discursive and narrative perspectives. Eero has published widely and served in editorial roles in leading scholarly journals. Last but not least, Eero is an EIASM board member for several years now. Thank you for your attention. Eero, welcome, and I now pass the microphone to you.
Thank you, Christina, for the very generous and kind introduction, and thank you both, Christina and Jérôme, for having me on board. I mean, on the board of EIASM, but on board in this wonderful webinar series. So I'm thinking that it's indeed a great pleasure and privilege, and I think it's a great series, and it's just wonderful to have my own slot in this. So the topic of today is unusual. So with Jérôme, we were having at least a few words about what to focus on. And we decided that maybe it's time to really take this issue seriously. It's in part because on the one hand, we believe that there's a need to, an opportunity to advance organizational studies by broadening the focus and scope to also include organizations that are not so often studied in this domain. And by the way, broadly defined. So when I'm talking about organizational studies, I'm including a lot of stuff in that. And maybe that's a mistake from the start, because with EIASM it should be management. But you know, have faith. This kind of makes sense, that it's organization studies comprising of various perspectives and traditions and disciplines and methods and so forth. And then there's a personal reason for being happy and really fascinated by this issue, which is that in the past few years, I've been fortunate to have been working with colleagues and friends on various terrific cases, I would say, which are not the usual ones that we typically study in business schools. And also, as Christina was pointing out, I've had the opportunity to serve in editorial roles. So in many ways, I've also encountered that the issues that I'm going to focus on from that perspective. So what do I mean by this? I think that oftentimes, or most of the time, management studies focus on firms and business organizations. And when it comes to different methods, when I'm thinking about case studies or qualitative research, it tends to be typically a question of longitudinal case studies that are drawing on interviews, but oftentimes not perhaps historical, or they are not methods that are somewhat out of not the usual ones in terms of dealing with case studies, are not being all the time appreciated. So I'm struggling to say this, but I'm going to focus on historical analysis as an example of a methodology which I think has a lot to give to organizations and management studies. So my argument is that a lot that we can really benefit from having a broader perspective on organizations and cases and using methods such as historical analysis. And it's actually great to see that, you know, there are a lot of others who are with me or with us in terms of becoming more and more interested in these other methods, including historical analysis. And there's also increasing interest in things like extreme organizations. And I think these are very useful trends, and they are actually helping us to achieve precisely what I was kind of saying is the core issue here that warrants attention. But my purpose here is not to remain or stay at this ideological level of preaching, and I think that I'm also partly here preaching to the converted. So what I mean is that in addition to this basic idea that we should value a more open approach to various kinds of organizations as case examples, and that we should be appreciating the various kinds of methodologies that exist, I'm focusing on the pragmatics of this, because it has turned out actually quite difficult to combine studying unusual organizations with contributions to organization studies. And this is partly because of these methodological issues, such as questions about generalizability, and in part a question of carving out or being able to articulate a contribution that would make sense. And all of this, for better or for worse, tends to culminate in this question of, whether or not one can then sell these papers and make them publishable in the leading journals. And that's the real motivation for this talk, in terms of not, staying at this level of saying that, okay, we need more historical analysis, we need more ethnographic analysis, we need to look at different kinds of organizations. I'm saying that yes, but how to do this is the issue that I'm trying to unravel in part in this talk. So what's going to happen is that I'm going to start with a few learning points. As an author and as an editor, I've tried to make sense of this big challenge. So I'm going to not present a recipe that anyone could just follow and be successful, but a few pointers which I think are useful when we think about combining or working at the intersection of organization studies and doing that with historical case studies of unusual organizations. And then I'm going to be presenting two projects or two papers of mine that serve as examples. And here, it's going to be a little bit of self-advertisement. So I apologize for that. But at the same time, I think we can blame Jérôme for this too, I suppose, because you were kind of encouraging me to use my own examples. So the two papers I'm going to use as examples are one with Japanese family companies or family businesses, and it's a paper that deals with how these organizations, which have existed for hundreds of years in many cases, how they deal with their past, and especially use or do not use their motto or identity statements when confronting new challenges. So that's one. And the other one is about the Sicilian Mafia and strategic ambiguity. So those are the cases that I'll be using here as examples, and I'm also very happy to share other things about and around these cases. So that's what's coming. And I was given instructions that, maybe 30 minutes or so for the talk, and then we can have plenty of time for any discussion. But I also want to say that, anytime you have some questions or points, or you strongly agree or disagree, let's just take it as it comes. We are a nice sized group here, so I think we can have dialogue also along the way. So any way you want, you can also use the chat function or whatever, and we can take it from there. Okay, so at this point comes the technological challenge of sharing the screen, but at this point I think we're all used to using Zoom quite a lot, so I'm confident that this works. And by the way, I'm starting with this. I think this is the best part of Oxford. So I just want to give you a few seconds with this nice view of the very heart of Oxford University. So that's another piece of advertisement to the in the beginning of this session. But here's what I promised to focus on. So, okay. So there are people like me and us who are interested in doing this, studying organizations that are they're not the typical business firms, and using methods such as historical analysis. So historical analysis, and by the way, I'm focusing on historical analysis, but I'm not saying that this is the only way of doing this, but I just want to give this a little bit more focus. Otherwise, it would be too much to cover in one session. So what's typical in historical analysis? And apologies if this becomes very high level or stereotypical or superficial even, but please bear with me for the sake of the argument of juxtaposing historical analysis and organization studies here. So historical analysis, what's happening in historical analysis is typically that it's really detailed, and the point is to provide rich descriptions, not description as a way of saying that it's not theoretical, but I think that's the essence or the gist of great historical work, that one is able to look into the details to understand historical processes and practices and their implications. And it's also the case that that typically historians value the accumulation of empirical findings more than theoretical contributions per se. So typically what we have in books or articles that are dealing with historical analysis are like really detailed, rich, well-crafted narratives of what has been going on in these particular organizations from a specific point of view, right, perspective. What's happening in organization studies? Again, apologies for being quite high level and perhaps not doing justice to the various streams and different perspectives and methods in our own area. But I think here it's almost the opposite, in the sense that it's not the rich description of the cases that it's usually being valued, but it's more a question of the generalizability of the findings. So that we should be studying things that allow us to also understand what's going on in other organizations, be they companies or other types of organizations. And theoretical contribution has, not least because of the dominant role of the leading journals, become really a big preoccupation in this area. So that, for instance, AMJ, Academy of Management Journal, where I've served as an associate editor, this has become the one single most important thing in terms of getting papers published. So at this point, and you know this, but I think it becomes clear that it's not easy to combine these things. And furthermore, you could add more things to the list of challenges. For instance, historians typically value authenticity in analysis and evidence. So they are, for instance, suspicious of retrospective interviews, whereas organization studies typically draw on retrospective interviews because organization scholars think that, archival evidence, minutes of meetings or whatever they are actually not so interesting as people's experiences and their reflections on those. So there's a there's a lot of tension there. Other point, which is in practice important, is that historians really value spending a lot of space on the description, and that's why books have been the primary outlets for really great historical work. Whereas for organizational scholars, it's turned out it's more the article format, and what's in these articles typically needs to be very analytical, in the sense that it's more than description. And oftentimes we in organization studies, especially editors and reviewers, keep on dismissing mere description. So there's a lot of tension between these two domains. So what to do? This is not a success recipe, but these are the 3 points I wanted to deliver here based on my own experience as an author, oftentimes failing to get my stuff published, sometimes succeeding in this, and as an editor who has been dealing with a whole lot of manuscripts in AMJ and also in other journals. So what to do? I think one way of thinking about this, and it's certainly not the only way, is to think that we have two narratives if we are doing this kind of work. One narrative is the empirical narrative. So we have a unique case, an interesting case, a revealing case, right? Unusual case. And then we have the theoretical narrative in terms of being able to see something which has a point that is generalizable in one way or another. So in the best of cases, we can combine the two narratives in the papers that we develop. And point number one in doing this is being able to turn the uniqueness of an unusual case into a revealing case, meaning that something that might initially stand out as very different from the typical cases of organizations that we're looking at can actually become one that allows us to see the processes or practices or the phenomena that we're interested in a deeper way, and elucidate those processes and practices that we are really trying to pin down. The second point is, in my view, being true to the methodology. So if it's an historical case study, I think it's important that the sophistication in doing this shows. So I think that's the way to go, meaning that if we're drawing on historical methods, it's not self-evident as to how to do that in the organization theory context, but I think that we can actually add to organization theory by drawing on some of the best practices in historical analysis. More about that later with the examples. And the third point is, and maybe this is the most important one, which is to say that when we then deal with these unusual cases, it's a question of being able to pull this off as a way of developing this theoretical way of looking at the case in question, which typically in the best of cases results in an argument that is based on the unusual case, but is packaged in a way that provides also this theoretical story. Okay, and by the way, I only now saw Fabio, you pointing out it's the Bodleian Library indeed in the first slide. Maybe that was the most interesting slide in my presentation, but anyway, you got that. All right. So, and I should also warn you, and some of you know me, so I have really bad sense of humor. So I should have prepared my jokes, which I didn't, which means that it's very strange. So sorry about the sidelines. By the way, something which I do appreciate with Oxford is this sense of irony and dry humor, which helps to deal with difficult issues. Okay, those are sidelines to this. But let's move on to the work that I'm using as examples. And here's another commercial break, or this is repeating the same thing I said in the beginning, in the sense that I've had this luxury of working with great scholars and people focusing on super interesting and unusual cases. And the first one I'm going to be presenting from the point of view of the framework I just gave to you guys is this one with Inan Sasaki, Josip Kotlar, Davide Ravasi, and myself dealing with the revered past, which is about historical identity statements and strategic change in Japanese family firms. More about that, but we're going to focus on that in a minute. The second example is then collaboration with Giulia Cappellaro and Amelia Compagni, which is about strategic ambiguity, using that for protection. And this is about struggles over opacity, equivocality, and absurdity in the case of the Sicilian Mafia. I'm also advertising some other projects here just to show you that, you know, I'm super excited about these cases and projects that are fun to begin with and very interesting and very informative in terms of, you know, one is able to learn about all kinds of things. And some of them then also make theoretical sense from the point of view that they can lead to some theoretically relevant contributions. So one is this forthcoming paper in AMJ, which is about increasing dispositional legitimacy. The title, well, maybe it's not the world's greatest title, but it's about the Cree First Nation or nations in Quebec, in Canada. So we used to call them Indians, which is not the right term to use, but just so that you understand what we're talking about. So that's one interesting advertisement of a cool paper, and two other ones. One where we have been with colleagues studying students' narratives of what they would like to do as entrepreneurs in North Korea. Can you imagine that, North Korea? And then there's one a long-term project with my colleagues in France about the drink absinthe, which got banned and is nowadays again being enjoyed by people. So these are just examples of my own projects, and of course there's a whole big bunch of cool papers that have been published recently with unusual, fantastic cases that are interesting themselves, but also help us to focus on specific theoretical issues and create a contribution to organization theory. Okay, so I'll jump to the first paper now. So how did this get started? So unusual studies of unusual organizations may actually start with some unusual observations. So here it's all thanks to Inan Sasaki, who is both Japanese and Finnish, and she's now at Warwick in the UK. So she got access to this interesting material about companies that have existed, many of them for hundreds of years, and still keep their initial or newer motto statements as identity statements. And these seem to be playing important roles in these organizations. Okay, so that's the starting point, like a discovery of these motto statements that have existed for a real long time. And then we got started in terms of trying to figure out what's going on here. And after some reflections with the Josip and Davide, then we came up with this idea that, this is actually really relevant for the discussions that we're now having in organization studies about rhetorical history and uses of the past. So these are themes that are important for historians, but just to paint the bigger picture, there's also a vibrant discussion in strategy research and institutional research and in other streams of organization studies about like how do companies or other organizations make use of their history, and this can be seen as rhetorical history. So that's the theoretical angle that we then took to make sense of this unique material. And by the way, I should also just share my personal interest in the very beginning. I didn't know that there are companies like this. Like I think the oldest one in our initial list of companies was founded before Columbus went to America. And some of these companies have had and really cherished these motto statements for more than 400 years. So this is, I think, just unbelievable from the I suppose Western modern perspective. So a lot of learning points, and I can tell you more. Maybe not in this webinar, which is being recorded, but a lot of learning points about sake and the rest of it that some of these companies have been producing for a real long time. Okay, so these are the starting points. And by the way, I should also share the end result with you in the sense that this got published in a special issue in Strategic Management Journal focusing on strategy and history in 2020, if you want to look this up. So what are the key findings? Okay, this is it. Nothing more, nothing less. That's it, basically. Us, after going back and forth with the material, meaning the archival material in terms of the initial motto statements, and then relating those to the challenges that many of the companies were facing in terms of new strategic change. We were, through some iterations we started to focus more and more to the rhetorical activities of these companies and their managers, and then realized that we can capture a big part of that with the notion of discursive strategy, meaning that these as the list of the discursive strategies. The first one, remembering, which is basically reproduction of the motto statements. And the final one, replacing, which is basically, developing something new. These are not the most interesting ones, but the interesting ones are here in between: elaborating, recovering, and decoupling. And I'll just say a few words about each. This is not really detailed, and if you're interested, please have a look at the paper. But elaborating basically means that it's what these people do when they transfer part of the historical statement into a new one, elaborating its implications for the current context. And one of the examples that we give or provide in the paper is this Gekeikan company, which is indeed one of the sake producers. So there's a picture of their original brewery and then some pictures of their motto statements. But the point is that they've done this quite a few times over the years, like picking up bits and pieces from the original ones and then elaborating or developing those so that they would help, for instance, when growing and when internationalizing, as this company has been doing. So retaining its focus on sake production and to the many of the initial values captured in the ancient motto statements, but then also combining those with the new things that are important in terms of, making it in the international markets of sake production and sales. This is another one. You wouldn't usually perhaps associate a university with a family business, but this is the origin of this Tokyo Keizai University, founded at the end of the 19th century. So here's the story is different. It's a question of recovery. So for a long time, when approaching the 1980s and 1990s, this university, which in a way needed to become broader and internationalize, was constrained by the fact that their prevailing guidelines and value statements were kind of focusing on the national context, to put it bluntly. But to deal with this challenge, then the managers or the leaders of the university then went back to the initial motto statements and actually found a lot of support there for going forward. And then, there were these other statements. I'm not going to go into details like honesty and responsibility. So, for instance, this building then was named Forward Hall. So that was a way of using, as if being an historian, like discovering stuff in the past and using that to in a way reinvent what the orientation of the organization was. Okay, and here's the third example: decoupling. What's going on here? Here it's different again. Here it's more a question of like realizing that, hey, the ancient statements may be really important, but they only help us go so far, right? And this is oftentimes happening, I guess. So this means that there's this coexistence of the historical statement and a new one which is serving complementary purposes in your circumstances. So here the example is a producer and sales of alcoholic beverages called Yamanaka-Himon Shoten, and here the original statements were very much about keeping the company in the hands of the founders and the family, and respecting what the key people are saying, whereas then their strategic challenges were actually calling for a much more open approach to strategizing and developing the organization, leading to this coexistence of two statements. Okay, so there's so much more to be said about these examples and the other tens of cases that we're looking at, but I'll just move on to the contribution by saying that, hey, so what have we then learned from studying these unusual organizations? We are claiming in the paper that we've learned a lot, and we can make a contribution to the uses of the past literature by, first of all, showing how the past may not be that easily manipulated as many others are nowadays saying when they're studying rhetorical history. At least these examples are ones where the past is really important, and you have to make sense of the past so that you can move on forward. And we're also saying that we reveal some of the most interesting cultural historical practices and strategies as to how to actually deal with this past that is seen as important. And then, of course, we're also claiming that there's a contribution to research on Japanese family firms per se, especially helping to elaborate the tension between the past and the future when upholding the values over time. Okay, let me pause here actually for a moment if you have any questions about this case before jumping to the other example of the mafia. I hope people are still awake at this point in the morning. It's not that early morning anymore. So if you have any questions or comments on this particular case, please just shout and we can take it from there. Okay. If not, let me move to the second example. And by the way, I'm really openly, welcoming any comments or questions any time, but we can also do that when the actual presentation is done. So the other example then is a very different context, but it's an unusual organization that we very well, most of us know, at least to an extent, pretty well in the sense that it exists. So it's about the Sicilian Mafia. And this project, which took, again, a few years, then resulted in this AMJ paper that was published early this year. So it's a fresh paper, 2021 in Academy of Management Journal. So I'm not pretending that I would be the one behind the project. It's Amelia Compagni and Julia Cappellaro, who are at Bocconi in Milan. And they studied this project of being increasingly interested in the Sicilian Mafia from a couple of perspectives. And they started to collect this archival material about, how we have made sense of the mafia over time. That was the initial broader perspective taken. And then gradually we realized that this is a lot about ambiguity, and in particular strategic ambiguity. This became clear only in the revision process, actually. But then we realized that, yeah, this is the thing to focus on. So that this is a fantastic case study. I think most of us are interested in the mafia, at least in some ways. But then we realized that this unusual case can also inform us a lot in terms of what strategic ambiguity is. And by the way, I should say the term strategic with ambiguity means that the organization is using ambiguity to its own benefit. So this is different from the perhaps the conventional view on ambiguity, which is to say that ambiguity is a problem. But here it becomes a struggle between the mafia, who more or less wants to, avoid being, held accountable, and then the state representatives, in particular, the prosecutors and the police, who are trying to get at the mafia to, be able to prosecute the criminals and to basically impede this organization from growing and doing things that people shouldn't be doing. And by the way, as to the pictures here, there are this is one of them. Well, really actually, it's a humbling experience to realize that there are so many people as prosecutors and police officers who have lost their lives in this struggle in trying to pin down mafiosi over time. And we dedicate this project actually to these people. So what's the essence in this paper then, in the spirit of studying an unusual organization and trying to learn from that in a way that would establish a contribution to organization studies? This is it. 3 things, basically. So after going back and forth with the very rich empirical material, we nailed it in our way, in our view, in a sense of distinguishing between 3 types of struggles, dealing with particular forms of strategic ambiguity, where the first one is opacity. Opacity means that we cannot see this very clearly, and I'll explain what we mean by that in a moment. The other one is equivocality, meaning that there are multiple interpretations. So that's another form of ambiguity. And the third one is absurdity, that it's paradoxical or really hard to understand to the extent that, combining different points or views or interpretations almost becomes impossible. So that's it. Again, like in the first paper, this is it. There's nothing more, nothing less really in the paper, in the sense of, making sense, making theoretical sense of strategic ambiguity with and around, in and around the Sicilian Mafia. Okay. I'll explain a little bit, though, as to what we mean by these 3 struggles. So it looks like a random period of time from 1963 to 1983, but there's a point with the first one. So, mafia has existed for a real long time, and it's hard to say when it really got going, but you could perhaps, or I could make a relatively convincing argument that it happened after the mid 1800s that the Sicilian Mafia really got going as an organization or as a network of organizations. And by the way, it wasn't called the Mafia for a real long time, and the people associated with the Sicilian Mafia, they see it as Cosa Nostra, our cause, and the members would be men of honor. And what this organization or network has been changing a lot over the years. But when we get to the early 1960s, there are some events, including the so-called Giaculli killing, where the mafia is responsible for the killing of a number of people that really, triggers this increasing attention in Italy first, and then elsewhere in the world, and also triggers a movement among state representatives to try to pin down what the mafia is doing, and ultimately aiming at holding the mafiosi accountable. But there's a problem. It's really hard to make sense of what the mafia is and who the mafiosi are. And at this point, it also becomes clear that the term mafia is totally misplaced. Actually, one root of what the mafia word means is that there was a novel a long time ago about gangs in Napoli, which is very different from men of honor in Sicily. But nevertheless, this misplaced term becomes more and more used, and gradually, though perhaps not so much in this first period, but later on becomes also a label used by the mafios themselves. That's a little bit of a sideline, but not altogether a trivial aspect, because this exemplifies the difficulties of the state representatives in trying to make sense of the mafia. Because even the label or the name is wrong, it's really hard to get to those people. And then there's the mafia, which is, as it's been doing for a real long time, engaging in things like protective silence and also targeted silencing, which means removing people who are trying to investigate mafia in the worst of cases by killing them. So what are the state representatives trying to do? Well, they're trying to develop frameworks and categories and laws to be able to get at the mafia. And eventually this happens through a whole lot of efforts that weren't successful, but eventually Italy passes this law that helps to make sense of criminal activities related to the mafia, where you can be prosecuted and where you can be sentenced, even if you, for instance, haven't yourself, as a chief mafiosi, you haven't done the criminal act yourself, for instance, being the one pulling the trigger or doing other crimes. So this is very helpful. So that helps to unravel or clarify the picture so that there's less opacity. So you can see more. And by the way, I should have mentioned omerta is the tradition of keeping silent about what's happening in the organization. All right, comes another period. And this is an interesting period because here we have the so-called maxi trials. Maxi means a lot of people, basically. So there were a number of trials in Italy where then the prosecutors, because of the passing of the law, because of having less ambiguity about mafia, they were really able to get to the mafiosi and prosecute and sentence a whole lot of them in unprecedented trials, which were also televised. So if you're interested in these, you can also just go to YouTube and you can see some really cool original footage of what's going on in the trials and the arguments on both sides. So what's happening in these trials is that the mafia is, again, trying to protect itself and doing quite a lot of things, like different things, partly in a way of in a concerted action to defend themselves. Partly it just happens that because there are multiple interpretations of the past and the future of the mafia, that it adds to this equivocality, which are like different interpretations of what this is, what the mafia is, basically. And just to give you one example, so there's one generation of mafiosi who are very much sticking to the idea of men of honor, and they have problems with what's been happening more recently with the drug trade and things like that. And then there's a newer generation, which is the opposite. Some of the mafiosi are also turning themselves in, not too many, but some of them becoming then in the eyes of the mafia, traders or in their own thinking, pentiti, who would be then revealing what they've experienced with the mafia and thus disclosing all kinds of activities and criminal acts. So what are the state representatives doing? They try to stick to like one interpretation, and their interpretation is that mafia is a criminal organization. It's a hierarchical organization, even if it's organized also in networks. Whereas the mafia is all the time trying to, or those who are prosecuted in particular, are trying to blur the picture, partly, very much intentionally, and partly because they also are not unanimous themselves. And this works in the sense that a big number of people are sentenced to prison. Then comes another period, close to what we are still living at this point. So what do the state representatives want to? They want to take an additional step. They also want to get to those people who are not in the core of the organization, but who are their allies. They want to get to the gray area, including politicians and other people who would be corrupt in Sicily or other places in Italian society or in the US and elsewhere. What's happening here is that the dynamic is analogous to the previous stages, but the strategies are different. I'm just going to skip some of the details here, but just saying that whilst the prosecutors are really trying to get at people like the longest term serving Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, those who are being prosecuted and those who are speaking in the voice of the mafia are really making use of the difficulties that the state representatives are having in making the arguments. And this really ends up in this paradoxical sense of like not all pieces fitting together, and also in a sense of absurdity, in the sense that many of the claims really are not that successful. Okay, from the state representative's point of view. So Mafia is a cool case, unusual case. You know, we have great films and stories and books about the Mafia, and here's our interpretation, which I admit is less exciting, but there's a theoretical point here. So we're trying to say that, okay, there are at least these three types of ambiguity and struggles, and in this particular case, it unfolds from opacity to equivocality and absurdity. And we ended the paper with saying that, okay, this has led actually to this recent failure to really get to the depth of things from the point of the state representatives. And I must admit that when we finished the article in the beginning of 2020, I thought that maybe we were, or maybe my colleagues were exaggerating in the sense that there's a kind of a paralysis here. And I was thinking that, you know, isn't the Mafia less of an important force at this point? But you know what happened when COVID came? What people have been seeing in Sicily and elsewhere is that Mafia has been not only operating under the surface, but also becoming more visible in a way of helping people who have been suffering from COVID and helping the poor and so forth in Sicily. So that's, again, a little bit of a sideline, but to me, it's also a sign that this is not the end of the story. It goes on and on and on with these kinds of organizations who need to protect themselves. And it's all about ambiguity, in our view, at least. So what's the contribution? Mafia, what a great story. Maybe our version of this story is less exciting than the Godfather films, but we are arguing that by taking and sticking to this strategic ambiguity angle, we can really make a contribution by showing how this maintenance of strategic ambiguity is pulled off. And we in particular dig into the role of silence and silencing, which are important organizational phenomena, but really hard to pin down or understand. Then, of course, we're also saying that just like in the previous paper, there's also a more specific contribution to clandestine organizations, trying to, or helping to better understand the relationship between ambiguity and secrecy in particular. Okay, I'm going to stop here. So I hope that these two examples illuminate the ways in which we can make use of unusual organizations, be authentic in our historical analysis, be true to the cases, but still focus on specific theoretical issues which can be seen leading to more generalizable findings and conclusions and ultimately contribution. Okay, as a final word, I'm just going to continue on this advertisement route. This is not necessarily historical analysis, but we have just put together this call for papers for our special issue in Journal of Management Studies, which is about extreme organizations. So very much in line with the idea that there are unusual organizations that can help us a great deal in terms of making contributions to organizations, and in this case also to strategy research. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much. So at this point, now is a good time to raise any questions or provide comments, and we have good time for that as well.
Well, I've got a question. Well, or if you prefer, some comments. First of all, thank you very much for this interesting presentation and for your understatement. I recognize the style of English gentleman in you. The article about mafia touched me deeply because Italy is my home country. And so it's an interesting topic to take into consideration. And the role of silence that you have underlined in your study is such an important characteristic feature to understand and to analyze. That I would like to simply to make a very simple consideration. In a world where organizations try to raise their voice and to make themselves renowned around the world by using every possible tool. We've got an unusual organization who uses silence exactly in a different way, in a different direction. They would like to promote themselves without being recognized and easily identifiable. Which is quite weird. But it's an approach that have worked in specific period of times. As you said, we had some bomb attacks that murdered important people of law in Sicily, and so that was not the time when mafia families were silent. But I totally understand the importance of your research and this idea of strategic ambiguity. My only concern, but honestly, you've been very effective in presenting this, is that some ideas about mafia at a general level have not helped to understand this phenomenon deeply. For example, the history of evolution of mafia has been romanticized by the movie The Godfather in a way that doesn't represent the brutality of this phenomenon. And we need to recognize that even if Italy is the only country who created 3 different mafia organizations, which are the one based in Sicily, another one in Campania and Reggio and Calabria, and the third one, the Sacred Family, based in Puglia. This criminal organizations have been exported and now are eradicated in many different countries. So it's a global phenomenon, unfortunately, as global is the business. Global is the world we live in. In terms of, I don't want to speak much, but there is one point that I want to make. I'm a PhD student. I'm a lecturer as well. I was in Oxford, and I had the privilege to lay on library. I enjoyed my time in Oxford, but now I'm a PhD student, and what is fascinating for me is the use of qualitative research to conduct interesting analysis. And so a very simple question can be this one. How can you find unique cases? Do you study many different cases and then you select the right one? Or do you prefer to make the right one a unique case, or make the only case you study unique in a way given to the specific features that you can identify? So basically the process is in which way you identify uniqueness.
Thank you, Fabio. I'll get to the question, which is a great question, and indeed the focus of the talk in a moment. But let me just, really thank you for elaborating on the mafia and the strengths and weaknesses of our focus and analysis. And let me just react on a couple of things. I think it's exactly the way you say that it's this romanticized view of the mafia, which has been partly helping people to know about it, but then also misguided many in terms of the nature of the organization, and also perhaps in a way ironically legitimated some of these activities. So I'm the first to say that we need a historical angle, and what I regret here as well is that our take is relatively superficial, partly because of the focus, and partly because we really needed to concentrate on this dynamic of like mafiosi versus the prosecutors and the police, which may also give a simplified view of ambiguity itself, because within the organization there are lots of forces that are making sure that it's not ambiguous in the sense that if you are at the core of the organization, it's not ambiguous at all after a while as to what you are supposed to be doing if you are a soldier in this organization, or captain, or higher up in the hierarchy. And then there are other things which are again like both ambiguous and not ambiguous there, like people learn as to what they're expected to do. So if and you, Fabio, know more about this, but I'm just simplifying it. So if you are the big chief and you have your ways of telling me to do something, even like remove a person or kill a person, but it doesn't mean that you have to send me an email or tell me that. You just like indicate that in other ways. So these are like very important aspects of ambiguity that we didn't include in our analysis, just talking about ambiguity. But it's that the other thing that is also true, what you said, is that it's this plurality of what the mafia organizations are, which is interesting. So the origins in Italy, or different parts of Italy, and different roots and origins. And I'm not claiming to be the world's best mafia expert at all. And then
it's interesting that in the historical analysis, if we go back to the unity of Italy, and we remember Garibaldi, who conquered the south of Italy, he was able to do that thanks to the initial mafia families who supported him. So initially there were farmers who supported the unit of the south of Italy with Garibaldi, and then the movement grow in other directions.
So true, and you know more about the history of Sicily as well, and it's true that we kind of, especially non-Italians, we kind of think that Italy has been there forever, which is not true at all. It's a relatively recent nation state. I mean, of course, with the huge historical legacies going all the way to Rome and these different parts. And this is a little bit of sideline here. But I think the historical trajectories are hugely interesting and important in terms of understanding what happens. And then there's this other side, which you also point out, which is this almost like this super successful export of the mafia thing. So now you have, mafias here and there. And by the way, a great scholar who's an expert in Sicilian Mafia told us when studying this project that it's okay to study the Sicilian Mafia. They won't get at university professors, but I would be more careful when studying the Russian Mafia. So that's a reminder that it can be a little bit scary. And yes, another anecdote, I'll just share it. And so we have not encountered any difficulties, but Julia got one phone call in the beginning of the project. So it's interesting that the mafia has, even nowadays, a quite extensive network of following up what's going on. But now finally to your question. I think, and your question is, just to repeat that, the question is, and how do we then find these unusual organizations to study? So I have a twofold answer, and this is a very honest answer, and it's perhaps not the one that one would expect to hear. I think it's opportunistic. That's number one. But opportunistic, not in a negative sense, that we think that people are opportunistic, and that's not the way it should be. But I think it should be like that, in the sense that we as scholars should be curious about all kinds of phenomena and all kinds of cases. And at times there are these gems or these fantastic, unique cases that we are able to study. And of course, there are a number of steps there. We might be interested in studying many things, but it may turn out that, oftentimes turns out to me, that it's impossible, or I can only get to some of the people. I cannot do enough interviews, or the archives are non-existent, or so forth. So many times it stops before it really gets going. But if it gets going, and this is the other part of my answer, I think it's a question of this abductive process. So I'm the first to say that I think it's very much inductive or exploratory in terms of these unusual cases. And I think it probably should be like this, in a sense of just becoming really interested in an organization or phenomena, then pursuing that on its own terms, and then bringing in the theoretical reflection in terms of like, okay, what is this a case about? And then linking that to something interesting, which is an important theoretical issue. Okay, so that was a longish answer to your great question.
Thank you very much, Eero.
And thank you also for others for your thanks in the chat. Are there other questions or comments at this point?
Hi, I actually have one comment. So first of all, thank you. It was super interesting, both of the cases, and the first one where you discussed dealing with the past kind of brought to my mind something that I've been interested in lately, which is the way these kind of new online spaces and social media in particular allow for kind of new tools for dealing with, and also increasingly, I think, manipulating the past, in a sense that where organizations have their timelines and feeds and their posts and so on, they can be edited in retrospect, and also algorithms then play into how these stories, or the stories they tell online kind of change afterwards. So I've been just thinking that could maybe a historical approach be used to study these kind of phenomena? Or do you know of some, maybe, I don't know, literature that deals with using a historical approach in the online spaces?
It's a great question, and I know that you are an expert in this in terms of social media and all the rest of it. My quick reaction is that it's very interesting with the social media and with the big data that we have now, because it's a relatively recent phenomenon. So in some senses, I think it's hard to draw exactly from existing traditions in historical analysis, or for instance in rhetorical analysis or linguistics. But in another sense, of course, it's been with us for a real long time, because I personally, I'm just, and you know this, I continue to be interested in these discursive processes and practices and strategies, and I think they haven't changed that much. I think the body of available ways in which we present our arguments or stories, if you want to call them that, they have been there for a real long time. So in that sense, the theoretical building blocks, I think, are there. I think rhetorical history and the recent revival in it, or revival in terms of an increasing interest in also among organizational scholars, in that I think it's more of an opportunity now than something which helps to provide tools and frameworks for us. But so I would see it more like an opportunity for you and others to do what you think is best, and then contribute to building to our body of knowledge. And I hope this isn't totally unclear or high level. But what I mean is that theoretically, I think there are a lot of ingredients that are the same, but platforms are different and unique, and that's where the contribution, that's where the opportunity for contribution lies. I don't know, Anna, if this makes any sense to you.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Maybe just an add-on to this. I think that I kind of here provided a very rosy picture of historical analysis. I should probably update that a little bit here by saying that, hey, there is no one way of doing historical analysis. Historians know it very well themselves. There's a great variety of different approaches which are not at all the same, and there are a lot of conflicts among these different positions and among historians in terms of what's right and what's wrong in historical analysis. So this means that there are a lot of sources that can be helpful, but that there's no one way of doing this.
In relation to that, what are the quality criteria you have used to ensure rigor in your studies?
Could you repeat that in terms of criteria?
Sorry, what are the quality criteria you have used to guarantee rigor in your studies? You have talked about authenticity and anything else? Or can you explore this a bit further?
Yes, it's a great question, and I think it again goes to the, if you allow me for an elaboration. I think it is this process of becoming increasingly focused on something that is important in the first place to understand, so that it's not enough that, for instance, with the mafia case, that we collect like thousands of documents and keep them in good order and do some overall coding. I don't think that's really the issue, or enough, even if that's important per se. But the importance in terms of the quality of analysis comes crucial, or the quality in that becomes crucial when we focus increasingly on something more specific. And then I think it's a question of really finding evidence, to use an old-fashioned term, but I think it serves our purpose here, to back up the claims or the hunches that we have from our theoretical thinking. And here I think authenticity, what I would mean as authenticity, is that authenticity in terms that, we do find that's important. We have that in the archival material, for instance. And that we are authentic also if we're saying that, okay, we're doing historical analysis, we're really doing the historical analysis. So it's not only an anecdote, like one sentence that someone is saying, but we can place that in context, and we know more or less that this is important, this really happened, or this played a key role. And authenticity, or perhaps your word rigor there, must include like the counterfactual aspect of it, like ourselves as scholars, then asking the question of, was it really so, or did something else happen, or what could have happened, to make sure that the pieces of information and evidence or material that we provide are really the key to the issue. Okay, any other comments or questions? Or
if I may, I would like to thank you so much, Eero, for it was so inspiring. I was wondering to which extent, with that historical perspective, the fact of focusing on unusual organization help to understand the complexity of organization, as you have also produced lots of research on more classical or usual organization, how it has helped you to face differently the complexity of organization. That's the first. And second one will be, we have quite a lot of PhD students also following our webinars. What would be your advice if they decide to focus on an unusual organization during their PhD, for example, with a monography or other type? what would be your advice for them?
Okay. I need a cup of coffee to the great questions. So I think you're of course spot on, Jerome, on both questions. The first one is complexity of organizations or organizing, and to me this comes down to the first point I was trying to make in the framework part, that we should make sense of the uniqueness of our cases that are unusual from the point of view of them helping us reveal things that we wouldn't otherwise see. And I think this helps really to unravel complexity in terms of organizational phenomena. It helps to zoom in on something that we can see in these cases that we may not be seeing in others, even if these exist. So just a banal point about ambiguity or silence or secrecy, I would bet that we have those phenomena in almost any big organization that has been there for a while, but it's just that they play a lesser role, or they are not so visible that we could, make a meaningful study of those. So I think that it's exactly this, that looking at the unusual cases helps us to focus on something which is helping us to see the complexity, but not complexity in the sense of saying the world is complex, but to zoom in on something which is very specific and interesting and highlights a phenomenon better than the study of a more prototypical business organization, for instance, would help us to do. So I think it's a great question, and I hope that this somehow helps. The other question is also great. What to do, for instance, as a PhD student? Well, the first point is not do what I'm doing here today, which is to say that, okay, kind of bragging that I've had the opportunity to study several unusual organizations over the years and now publish those or present two papers at one go. Not do that. Focus on one. That's my advice. Be bold. Become, if you are interested in something and you can get access and you can dig deep, stick to that. That's my I think the best piece of advice I would be able to give. And in
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. In the best of cases, this is what happens. People become experts in that area. And as a PhD student or DPhil student, one doesn't always realize that it's those projects that one starts that you will be also living with for a real long time. And this is good. You may be publishing from your original ethnographic or historical or whatever study for a real long time, even after the thesis has been finished and accepted.
Thank you.
Okay, are we reaching the end point here? I'm looking at Christina, who's the boss and chair. It's up to you. I mean, I'm happy if there are additional questions or comments, but if not, I just want to thank you for the opportunity, and thank you also for this opportunity to have a dialogue about these specific aspects. And I realize that many people will be watching this later on as a recording, and I hope that this still makes some sense to you as well.
Okay, so no more questions or comments?
Just saying a very, very big thanks in name of EIASM, and I will let Christina, who is in better condition than me, to speak.
Yeah, that's thank you, Jerome. That's exactly what I wanted to say. Thank you so much, Eero, for this lovely speech. And yes, it is recorded. It will be available soon on our website. We will, of course, let you know. So we will stay in contact. And for the participants, please check the other dates of our webinars, and feel free to register. And by the way, Eero, just now I noticed in my email that 2 other people registered for this webinar, but just now. So probably they will be interested in the recording. I was not able to send them the link 10 minutes ago. So thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. It was lovely to see you all.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Jerome, and thank you all, and have a nice weekend.